The last thing Zhang Ming said to his wife before he asked for the divorce was, "You are nobody without my name." He said it at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in October, in the way he said most important things, without looking up from his phone, as a statement of fact rather than a cruelty, which was somehow worse than if he had meant it to be cruel. He was 61 years old, and he had built a media empire, and he had decided, sometime in the past year, that the woman who had sat across from him at this table for 30 years had simply become part of the furniture. Furniture did not need to be addressed directly. Wei An was 58. She was drinking her tea. She looked at him over the rim of the cup, at the top of his head bent over his phone, and she felt something happen in her chest that she recognized immediately. Not shock, because she had been watching this coming for a long time, and not grief exactly, not yet. Grief would come later, at night, in private, the way she did all the important things. What she felt in that moment was something older and quieter than both of those. She felt the end of something. And underneath the end, just barely audible, like the first note of a piece of music beginning in another room, she felt the beginning of something else. She set down her tea. "All right," she said. He looked up then, because he had expected more than that. 30 years, and she said, "All right." He had prepared for tears or recriminations, or the specific quiet dignity of a woman who knows she has been wronged and says so. He had not prepared for, "All right." "Wei An, I heard you," she said. She looked at him steadily. She had spent 30 years learning to look at him steadily, to be the still point in whatever storm was currently moving through his life. And she did it now out of habit, the way you do things you have practiced until they live in the body rather than the mind. "I'll call the lawyer this week." She picked up her tea again. He watched her for a moment with an expression she knew well, the expression of a man who has gotten what he wanted and is briefly uncertain why it doesn't feel the way he expected. Then his phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and the moment passed. Wei An drank her tea and looked out the window at the Beijing morning, the gray sky and the city moving below, and she thought about 30 years. She thought about what she had given to those years and what she had gotten from them, and what she was leaving the table with. She thought about the study on the 4th floor, where the filing cabinet stood in 3 rows, where she had spent 30 years sitting at a small desk beside his larger desk, recording everything. She thought about everything she knew. Subscribe right now, because what Wei An did in the 18 months after that Tuesday morning is why this story exists, and why Zhang Ming will spend the rest of his life wishing he had chosen different words. Zhang Ming had built his empire on a single talent. He understood power. He understood who had it and who wanted it, and how it moved between people. And he had spent 40 years positioning himself at the center of those movements, accumulating leverage the way other men accumulated money, knowing that leverage was the only currency that didn't devalue. He had started with a single trade publication in 1987, a small magazine covering the construction industry that he had bought with borrowed money and a great deal of confidence. By 1995, he had 3 publications. By 2003, he had 18, spanning finance, manufacturing, technology, and culture. By 2015, the Zhang Ming Media Group was one of the most influential private media organizations in China, with editorial relationships that shaped how industries saw themselves and, more importantly, how they saw each other. He knew everyone. He had files on everyone. He understood that information was power, and proximity to information was the next best thing. And he had spent 40 years building both. What he had not fully understood in all those years was that the woman sitting at the small desk beside his larger desk understood this too. He had married Wei An in 1993, when he was 30 years into nothing, and she was 28 and working as an editor at a literary magazine that paid almost nothing and that she loved completely. He had met her at a publishing industry dinner, and she had argued with him about the future of print journalism, with the specific, fearless precision of someone who had read more deeply and thought more carefully about the subject than he had. And he had found this attractive, in the way that confident men sometimes find intelligence attractive in women, as an ornament, as a reflection of their own taste, as evidence of their discernment. He had not understood what he was looking at. She was the most precise thinker he had ever met. She had the ability to sit with a complicated thing, a contract, a relationship, a situation with 15 variables, and reduce it to its essential structure, to find the load-bearing element that everything else rested on. She could read a room in 3 minutes and tell you exactly who was afraid of whom and why. She understood language the way surgeons understood the body, knowing where each word was attached and what would happen if you moved it. In 1994, Zhang Ming had been preparing for a difficult negotiation with a state-owned advertising conglomerate, whose cooperation he needed, and whose director was known to be resistant to private media. He had spent a week preparing his approach and shown it to Wei An over dinner. She had read it for 10 minutes and said, "You're approaching this as a negotiation. It isn't a negotiation. It's a face-saving exercise. He needs to believe it was his idea." She had rewritten his entire approach in an hour. He had walked into that meeting and done exactly what she said, and it had worked exactly as she predicted. He had told her she was brilliant and moved on. This was the pattern for 30 years. In 1998, she had identified a conflict of interest in a partnership agreement that would have cost him 60 million yuan if it had gone unnoticed. She had noticed it on a Sunday afternoon while reviewing documents he had dropped on her desk on a Friday evening. He had thanked her and made the call that fixed it and gone to his lunch. In 2004, she had understood, from a single offhand comment at a dinner party, that a media regulator was about to change the licensing framework in a way that would affect 3 of Zhang Ming's publications. She had told him the next morning. He had moved faster than any competitor and emerged from the regulatory change stronger than before. In 2009, she had negotiated personally over a private dinner she had arranged herself with the widow of a deceased publishing house owner whose estate held assets Zhang Ming needed. She had spent 3 evenings with the woman before asking for anything, and when she asked, the woman had said yes, because Wei An had understood what she actually needed, which was not money but acknowledgement, the recognition that her husband's work had mattered, and Wei An had given her that genuinely and completely. Zhang Ming had attended the signing and taken the photographs. He did not think of any of this as her contribution. He thought of it as the ambient support structure of his life, the way you think of air, as something that is simply there and has no particular origin. This was, he would later understand, the most expensive misunderstanding of his career. But that came later. What came first, in 1994, was the diary. He had started dictating because he had always processed things verbally, thinking out loud into the room, needing to hear himself work through problems. He had tried recorders but hated listening back to himself. He had tried assistants, but they were not subtle enough with what they heard. Wei An, who was already reviewing his correspondence and reading his contracts and attending his meetings, simply began writing it down. And she did it so naturally and so accurately, capturing not just the words but the reasoning behind them, that he had never suggested stopping. It became their ritual. At the end of each day, usually after dinner, he would sit in the study and talk. He talked about the meetings and the deals and the difficult people, and the opportunities he saw coming, and the problems he was managing, and what he thought about everyone involved. Wei An sat at her small desk with her notebook, and later her laptop, and she wrote it down. He told her everything. He told her about the deals he was most proud of, and the ones that still kept him up at night. He told her about the relationships he had maintained through careful management of other people's weaknesses, and the times he had used information to prevent problems before they became public. He told her about the arrangement he had with a licensing official in 2007, and the situation with the competitor's leak in 2011, and the way he had handled the journalist who had gotten too close to a story in 2014. He told her all of it, completely, because she was his wife, and she was the most discreet person he had ever known, and he had never once, in 30 years, had reason to believe that what went into that notebook went anywhere else. He was right. For 30 years, it went nowhere else. Wei An was 58 years old, and she was nobody without his name, and she sat at the breakfast table after he went back to his phone, and she thought about everything that was in those notebooks. 30 years of notebooks. She was an editor. She had spent her career understanding what made a story, what made it true, what made it matter. She had spent 30 years sitting beside the man who had built one of the most significant media empires in the country, recording everything, understanding everything, seeing the architecture of power from the inside. She had never written a word of her own. She called the lawyer that week, as she had said she would. The divorce was efficient and unsentimental, which suited both of them. She accepted the settlement, which was fair in the way that things are fair when the person offering it has no idea what the other person actually possesses. She took her clothes and her books and her notebooks and the small items that were hers alone, and she left the apartment in the Chaoyang district and moved to a small flat in a quiet Hutong neighborhood that she had always loved and that he had always considered insufficiently impressive. She set up her desk in the second room, the one that caught the morning light. She opened the first notebook. She began to write. She was not angry when she wrote. This surprised her. She had expected the writing to be the vehicle for something dark, the place where the grief and the rage finally went, but it wasn't. She was a professional. She had spent 30 years editing other people's emotions out of their prose, cutting the self-pity and the score-settling and the vanity, and leaving only what was true. She did the same with herself, precisely and without mercy. She wrote about power, about how it was built and maintained, and about what it cost. She wrote about the men who built it and the people around those men who made it possible and were never mentioned. She wrote about the gap between the official account of how things worked and the actual account, the one recorded in 30 years of evening notebooks by a woman at a small desk in the corner. She used no real names. She did not need to. The structures were the story, not the individuals, and she rendered the structures with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years inside them. She wrote for 14 months. It was the most solitary work she had ever done, which was strange because she had spent 30 years working alone. But the previous solitude had always been inside someone else's architecture, at her small desk in the corner of his room, contained within his schedule and his gravity. This solitude was different. It was entirely hers. She woke early and made tea and wrote before the city woke up. She wrote in the morning and stopped at noon and walked through the Hutong and came back and read what she had written and cut what needed cutting with the same precision she had applied to other people's work for 3 decades. She had edited enough writers to know that the hardest thing was not finding the material, but trusting it. She did not struggle with this. She had 30 years of material and she trusted every word of it. She sent the manuscript to 3 publishers under a name that was not her name. All 3 responded within 2 weeks. She chose the smallest of the 3, run by a woman she had known slightly years ago through the literary world, a publisher with a reputation for books that mattered and an understanding of how to protect an author who needed protecting. They discussed the anonymity arrangements carefully. Wei An was thorough. She had learned thoroughness from the best-run operation she had ever seen, which was, she understood with a clarity that had taken her some time to reach, the operation she had run herself for 30 years in service of someone else. The book came out in the spring. It was called 30 Years Beside the Shark: How Empires Are Built and What They Cost. It had no author name on the cover, only anonymous. The publishing house sent copies to 40 journalists, 12 academics, and selected business leaders across 4 cities. They sent no copies to anyone in the Zhang Ming media group. Zhang Ming received his copy from a colleague who called him on a Tuesday morning, almost exactly 18 months after the breakfast table, with the particular tone of a person delivering news they are not sure how to frame. "Have you seen this book?" the colleague said. He had not. He read it in one sitting, which was the longest he had sat still in years. He recognized everything. Every structural pattern, every described dynamic, every situation rendered in precise and specific prose that contained no names and no direct identifiers, but that painted the portrait of a particular kind of man and a particular kind of organization with such accuracy that he felt, turning each page, the specific and deeply uncomfortable sensation of being seen completely by someone who had no obligation to be kind about what they saw. He called his lawyer before he finished the book. His lawyer called the publisher. The publisher's lawyer said there were no names, no direct identifiers, no actionable claims. It was analysis and observation. It was protected. What specifically, the publisher's lawyer asked in the pleasant tone of someone who already knows the answer, was the objection. Zhang Ming called 3 journalists he had relationships with. He suggested the book was fabricated, the work of a disgruntled competitor, a hit job from a rival organization. The journalists listened politely. 2 of them had already read the book. 1 of them had already assigned a review. The review ran the following week. It called the book "The most precise and unsentimental account of Chinese business culture published in a decade." It called the unnamed author "someone who has seen the inside of power from close range and has the rare gift of describing what they saw without flinching and without agenda." It said, "Whoever wrote this book, they know exactly what they are talking about." Zhang Ming read the review and felt something he had not felt in 40 years of business, which was the sensation of holding a situation he could not manage. He had spent 40 years at the center of information, which meant he had spent 40 years with the ability to shape narrative, to decide what was said and how and when and by whom. He had believed, without ever articulating it, that this was a permanent condition, that the control of information was a skill that could not be used against him because he was the one who possessed it. He had been wrong. The book sold through its first print run in 3 weeks. The publisher ordered a second. An English translation was sold to a London house. A German rights deal followed. At a business conference in Shanghai that spring, a moderator asked an audience of 400 executives, "How many of you have read 30 Years Beside the Shark?" 312 hands went up. Zhang Ming was not at the conference. He had declined the invitation, which he had never done before in 40 years of attending every event that mattered, because he understood something that no amount of management could fix. He had spent 40 years being the person in the room that other people oriented toward, the person whose opinion changed the temperature, the person whose arrival rearranged the room in some invisible but total way. He had never imagined this could be altered by something as simple as a book. But a book had no face. A book could not be charmed or managed or made to feel the weight of obligation. It simply sat in people's hands and said what it said. And this book said it with such precision that the people who had spent years in the same rooms as Zhang Ming were now reading it with the particular attention of people reviewing their own memories from a new angle. He could feel the shift. In calls slightly slower to return. In meetings where the warmth was professional rather than personal. In certain men who had been in his orbit for 20 years, looking at him with an expression that contained, beneath the surface courtesy, a small and unmistakable distance. They did not say anything. They did not need to. He had spent 40 years reading rooms. He knew what he was reading. This was the loss that cost him most. Not the book's success, not the reviews, not the translation deals. The loss of the specific power that had always been his most important asset. The power to control the frame, to be seen the way he chose to be seen, to stand in any room and know that his version of himself was the one that occupied the space. He hired investigators to find the author. They came back with nothing definitive. The publishing house was professional and silent. The original manuscript had been delivered by courier. The contracts were signed with a name that traced to a registered entity that traced to nothing actionable. His lawyer said, "Even if you found the author, there is nothing to prove. No names, no defamation, nothing actionable. A book cannot be unwritten." In August, 6 months after publication, a journalist from a Hong Kong magazine arranged an interview with the anonymous author through the publisher. The author agreed to respond to written questions only, through the publisher's intermediary. The journalist sent 12 questions. The author answered 10 of them. The 11th question was, "Who are you?" The published answer was 4 words, "Nobody in particular." Nobody. The 12th question was, "Why did you write this?" The published answer was, "Because I listened for 30 years and nobody asked me what I heard. I thought it was time to say." Zhang Ming read the interview on his phone on a Tuesday morning, at the breakfast table where there was now only 1 cup of tea. He read it twice. He sat for a long time afterward looking at the table. There were things he knew and things he suspected, and things he would never be able to prove or disprove. He sat at the table and he thought about 30 years of evenings in the study, the sound of her pen on paper, the way she had always written without asking him to slow down or repeat himself, because she never needed him to. He thought about everything he had said in that room, completely and freely, because she was his wife, and she was discreet, and he had never once imagined she was also paying attention in a different way, a deeper and more professional way, the way an editor pays attention to source material. He thought about what she had said to him on the day he asked for the divorce. He had said she was nobody without his name. She had said, "All right," and finished her tea. He thought about what "all right" had meant. His phone rang. He did not answer it. He sat at the table in the apartment in the Chaoyang district, in the apartment that featured in architecture magazines, in the apartment where he had built everything he thought was permanent, and he sat in the particular silence of a man who has just finished understanding the shape of something he cannot change. And outside the window, Beijing moved in its ordinary morning rhythm. And somewhere across the city, in a small flat in a Hutong neighborhood that caught the morning light in a way she had always loved, a woman who had spent 30 years recording other people's words was sitting at her desk with fresh tea and a clean page. She was working on the 2nd book. She had not planned a 2nd book, but she had 30 years of notebooks, and she had discovered, in the 14 months of writing the first, that she had barely touched the surface of what she knew. She was 59 years old, and she had a great deal left to say. And she had found late and completely the specific satisfaction of saying it entirely on her own terms, with her own name that no one knew, in her own voice that no one had previously thought to ask for. She was nobody. She was, it turned out, exactly dangerous enough. And she was just getting started. If this story found you, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what's the longest you've ever quietly waited for the right moment? Because Wei An waited 30 years, and she used every single one of them.